HDR, volumetric lighting, parallax mapping, motion blur, real-time soft shadows. In 2005, all these graphical techniques, which we now take for granted, were cutting edge, and each one would punish a GPU in its own right. These shading effects made games look amazing though, and over the course of 2005, developers kept piling them on to the point where they were becoming mandatory even for a game to work. Yep, it was ever increasingly more common that if your GPU did not support a certain shader level, you could just not flat out run a game anymore. In this daunting age of rapid graphical advancement, the old guard of GPUs would not be able to keep up if you wanted to play the latest and greatest with all the bells and whistles turned up. Beefier graphics cards were needed to keep up with this rapid pace and allow users to get a glimpse at the future of game graphics on PC. Enter the Nvidia GeForce 7800 GTX. Launched in June of 2005, it had 50% more internal pixel pipelines than the 6800 series and optimized capabilities to double the instructions per clock for common shaders of the day. Its G70 architecture was tailored to the brutal demands of the era. It handedly beat its predecessor, and importantly, it allowed users to get a look into the future of PC graphics with its advanced shader support. So I would like you to join me in this video today, brought to you by Digital Foundry and Nvidia, as I go back to 2005 and check out the 7800 GTX and showcase iconic games from the day running on real vintage hardware. Now, telling the tale of this 7800 GTX is not only about the GPU as it was in 2005, but also how it would be in the future. What do I mean by that? Well, the highest version of DirectX supported by the 7800 GTX was DirectX 9.0C, which launched in August of 2004. DX9C was coupled with Shader Model 3, which brought about the ultra leap forward in graphical quality and techniques, which would power many new types of effects. It was a revolution for sure, but unlike before, DX9C would not just be sticking around for a few years to become a short-term stepping stone in computer graphics. No. DX9C and the graphical capabilities of the 7800 GTX would be relevant for nearly a full decade, thanks to the consoles, the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. See, while PC gaming in 2005 was going swimmingly with many new and gorgeous PC-only releases from big publishers, and they were constantly pushing the limits of technology forward, while after 2005, things started to change rapidly with the launch of the Xbox 360 in November of that year. Soon enough, publishers started neglecting the PC platform and their long-standing intellectual property there, and instead focused wholesale on the new and emerging HD console market. By 2008, for example, the amount of technology-focused PC releases had really dwindled, and consoles were now the lead development platform for nearly all larger-scale games. There are many reasons for this, of course, but the most interesting aspect for this video is the effects on the PC graphics industry. A great GPU from 2005 stayed around far longer than it would have in the past because the main development platform, the consoles, were just about 7800 GTX level in capability and power. The PS3 specifically used a partially cut down version of G70 GPU from the GeForce 7800 GTX. And with most game releases targeting that feature set and power level as a bare minimum, this 7800 GTX stayed relevant far longer than a past GPU might have. It allowed you to play some of the latest releases more than 7 years later. So while I'm going to be highlighting this GPU as it was in 2005 for this video, it is important to remember that it stuck around for quite a long time and did not fade into irrelevance. In fact, the 7800 GTX's technology was the basis for an entire generation of computer graphics. Okay, so what about the year 2005 though? What did the 7800 GTX bring to the table over GPUs of the past? As mentioned, On paper, it did have a 50% edge in pixel pipelines over the previous state-of-the-art 6800 Ultra. But if you look at core clock and memory bandwidth, gains are more minimal. So the type of performance upgrade it offered was more specific and less general than architectures before it. In those scenarios where a game was not using the highest level of shading, where the game was older and not using new shader tech, the upgrade over the 6800 Ultra could fall around the realm of 35%, such as we see here in 3D Mark 2005 by the mad lads at FutureMark. While this engine benchmark did support a shader Model 3 path, it released in later 2004 when GPUs supporting that technology were really uncommon, and graphical techniques leveraging shader Model 3 were scarce. So here, in this benchmark, we only see a 35% gen-on-gen uplift with the 7800 GTX over the 6800 Ultra. Same in F.E.A.R at 1600 by 1200 with one of the key features of the graphics turned off, the soft shadows. Here, the 7800 GTX manages a mere 32% uplift over the 6800 Ultra. And if you look at the frame rate graph, you can see how at moments it diverges and gets closer depending upon what the main limiting architectural aspect is. Areas with more particle draw, for example, tend to be closer as bandwidth upgrades on the 7800 GTX are more minor. It's nice to see higher frame rates, of course, but these gains are actually just only okay. The real winning point of the 7800 GTX was in its higher level shading performance. Now let's start with 3D Mark 06. This benchmark released in early 2006 and added in a number of shader Model 3 enhancements over that 2005 version. More shadow casting lights, higher quality shadows, and HDR lighting precision. It was much heavier, and its feature set now represented some of the heights of DirectX 9 rendering. In this bench, the 7800 GTX runs around 45% faster than the 6800 Ultra, and this is on the lower end of the scale. Go over to F.E.A.R and you can turn on its soft shadows, and you can increase the shading demands of that game, which now propel it to 49% faster than the 6800 Ultra. These are the same assets as before, but now with more intense soft shadow shading requirements. The 7800 GTX shows more of its true capabilities. With this near 50% performance upgrade over the 6800 Ultra, a user of a 7800 GTX could play F.E.A.R at 1024 by 768 and turn on the soft shadow option, something that just wasn't possible on a 6800 Ultra. Perhaps one of the biggest upgrades can be seen in Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay. That game offered a shader Model 3 renderer that added in a soft shadow option, and here we see a very significant 56% performance increase for that 7800 GTX over the 6800 Ultra. Thus, in 2005, the 7800 GTX offered a sizable upgrade, but its performance potential was much higher than some of that release software might portend. The GPU's true potential was only showcased by those forward-looking games with a lot of pixel shader usage. Games like Splinter Cell Chaos Theory or Trackmania Sunrise. Those titles saw greater gains than older titles or those with simpler shading. At launch in June of 2005, the biggest upgrades were limited to those titles that were supporting next-gen tech, and this divide between the 6800 Ultra and the 7800 GTX would increase as the years went on and complex pixel shading became standard. This is especially true for Unreal Engine 3 games, which required a shader Model 3 GPU and became increasingly common after late 2006. So if you had a 7800 GTX in 2005, what games would you be loading up to show its true power? Well, 2005 had a metric ton of incredible games and game demos releasing on PC in a variety of genres. But it is hard to deny that the early to middle 2000s was dominated by the first-person shooter, and one of the first that comes to my mind is Battlefield 2. While Battlefield 2 did not require or fully leverage Shader Model 3 and did not use Shader Model 3 specific effects like HDR lighting precision, it was still doing a good amount under the hood there to look as nice as it did and achieve its particular multiplayer rendering goals. With 64-player matches and the highest settings requiring more than 1 GB of system memory for good performance, Battlefield definitely excelled at displaying long view distances with a consistent LOD and a lot of moving parts. For me personally, one of the most interesting rendering aspects is how the shadowing is done. The game itself used baked direct shadows from the sun and local light sources, while characters, vehicles, and moving objects cast and receive real-time shadow maps. These shadow maps mixed with the baked shadows, so even static objects would cast them. So you can look at a baked shadow of a palm tree, for example, and see how it changes to a real-time shadow as soon as it touches a dynamic object, like the Humvee here. Usually games with baked lighting had a great disconnect between moving and static objects, but thanks to this mix system, larger objects would get precise, albeit somewhat blocky shadows cast onto them. That would ground them and mix them well with the environmental lighting. The shadows even cast onto your first-person hands and weapon model. That's pretty rad for 2005 when you think about it. Real-time shadow maps were still extremely rare at this time, yet here was a multiplayer game using them all over the place. And in a way, it didn't burn down the GPUs. Here, the 7800 GTX is running the game at 1024 by 768 with 4 times MSAA and hitting a great 60 FPS, barring those moments when a lot of smoke is on screen. I'd say this is very playable by modern standards, for sure. Now let's keep with that shooter theme. The next game every 7800 GTX owner had to have in their crosshairs was F.E.A.R. This game launched in October of 2005, and excuse the pun here, but F.E.A.R is a monolith in PC first-person shooters. So singularly good that going back to play it now, I'm astonished about how fresh it feels all these years later. Now, a big part of that for how incredible it feels and looks is the balance in the combat and how the AI reacts. But another part is the atmosphere from the game's graphical presentation. F.E.A.R uses shaders extensively, and it drove the game's visual language. Different types of distortions, blurs, and post-processing effect masks are leveraged heavily depending upon the context and the scene, either to induce horror or heighten the game's ballistic ballet. The game's defining slow motion effect is a great example. A full screen sharpening is applied, and a radial blur that distorts color and edge silhouettes fringes the screen's edge, where only the center region of your screen is now clear. This is where you're aiming and shooting, and it's an excellent way to show how the point man, your character, is hyper-focused and perceives time slowing down. And it's all driven by next-gen shading. But post-processing effects are not the only areas where this game did some patently next-generation things. It heavily leveraged parallax maps for its level textures, showcasing bricks and floors that look suitably 3D. Gunshots in the world would also leave fake 3D indents in the wall thanks to decals that do much the same. Shadows were plentiful in this game thanks to stencil volumes, and these could be modified with a soft shadow option, turning them from hard shadows into soft ones. While this style of soft shadow technique would not survive the middle 2000s, it is awesome to see how developers back then were still wrangling with how to best emulate the effect of a shadow's penumbra. And in F.E.A.R's case, it added another next level option to allow the game to scale to GPUs of the future, even beyond the 7800 GTX. And lastly, I wouldn't be myself if I did not mention the game's usage of ray marched volumetric lighting in what is perhaps an industry first. It allowed for soft rays of light that would be sliced with shadows in the game's murkier warehouses and sewers. Altogether, when you combine all these high-end shading effects, the game looked astounding, and it dazzles to this day. And part of that is because it aimed very high, even higher than the 7800 GTX. While it was a mighty GPU in 2005, F.E.A.R's highest settings were even mightier. With the soft shadow option in particular, it showcased a warning if you turned it on. Yikes! Fully maxed out on the 7800 GTX at 1024 by 768, you can have a number of scenes hitting 60 FPS even with soft shadows enabled, but as soon as combat starts up, with all those lit particle effects and full screen blurs, you can see the frame rate getting lower. The slow motion blur effect in the bullet time mode and the volumetric lighting on their highest settings are particular FPS killers, bringing down the FPS at times into the 30s when they are on screen. This is just how things were back in the day. Max settings took no prisoners, and F.E.A.R is one of the best examples of that. Max settings at this time meant this is for a future PC, and the game is all the better for it. Taking a break from first-person shooters, the next game that I think caused PCs to tremble in 2005 was Ensemble's Age of Empires 3. Now, I've talked about this game on the channel before in the context of its remastering, but I just wanted to take some time here to reiterate how forward-looking this game was in 2005, especially its rendering. It was fully leveraging many aspects of Shader Model 3 and produced visuals that are honestly not too far off from modern-day real-time strategy games, barring some low-poly models here or there. Ensemble went all out with its tech in the third entry of Age of Empires, and the studio fully embraced Shader Model 3.0, offering full HDR lighting precision with bloom, giving all the metals and water in the game a wonderful sheen that was unparalleled at the time. And the game also managed to use fully real-time soft shadows based on shadow maps at a time when pretty much no other game even dared to do this. And it all does this while having one of the most destructive worlds in an RTS game to date, where the environment and structures would fall apart when damaged using a real-time physics system. This game was, and honestly is, still fantastic looking, and it required one heck of a GPU to run it at full tilt. Playing the game maxed out at 1024 by 768, performance is generally quite good when doing the usual base micromanagement. But when combat gets going, even the mighty 7800 GTX can struggle to keep to 60 with these max settings on, dropping into the lower 40s or even potentially lower if a ton of particle effects explode and take up large portions of the screen real estate. This is something very typical of the time period. Great performance until all those transparent particles fill the screen. Still, you could always lower settings like anti-aliasing, which would net you back a lot of performance to make up for those areas where the game was heaviest, and you'd still have a fantastic looking game on the right monitor. The last game I want to talk about here in this 7800 GTX showcase is Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. While the game is oft remembered for its Xbox version, the PC version is truly a sight to behold. The game's environments are a bit low poly due to having to run on the original Xbox, but the developers made up for it by targeting an array of PC-exclusive Shader Model 3.0 effects for users to up the graphical quality significantly. First, you had HDR lighting precision and tone mapping, allowing for more accurate dynamic range in the game's lighting, giving darker areas a punchier look, and strong lights were now appropriately bright when positioned right on screen. Then you had parallax maps, giving textured surfaces 3D depth even though the ground's geometry was actually fully flat. And lastly, you had advanced soft shadow support. Now, the game's shadow maps were already fine as is, I would say, but this was an experimental option that filtered them further, giving shadows a softened edge where they otherwise could be aliased or overly sharp. Once again, though, this was in an age before developers had fully worked out how to do soft shadows and how best to do it. So this filter can sometimes overly soften the shadows at a lower resolution, and so smaller objects can sometimes be lacking a shadow as a result. But still, I find it a rather neat effect for users to try out. When all these effects came together, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory was a slick visual package that offered a preview into the next generation of games that would be coming over the next decade. And in spite of that, actually, the 7800 GTX runs it incredibly well. It manages a near perfect 60 FPS at 1024 by 768 maxed out, with headroom to spare actually quite often. So you could run it at a higher resolution, though potentially with drops under 60. Now, as the games have hopefully shown, the 7800 GTX could muster the power for the coming age of shader Model 3 enabled games, offering significant performance improvements over its predecessor in those titles that used the heaviest of shading. With that power, the GPU allowed users to glimpse into that future of rendering with HDR lighting precision, next-gen soft shadows, or volumetric lighting. Still, this glimpse of the future was heavy sometimes, right? Some games like F.E.A.R's highest settings targeted GPUs that simply did not exist yet. Or did they? With the power of SLI, you could combine two of these 7800 GTXs to dramatically increase performance. As we see in this bench here, nearly a full doubling of frame rates over single GPU in a GPU-limited instance in F.E.A.R. How did this tech work? What was it like? Well, I'm saving that for a future video, but let's just say that's a fascinating story in its own right. Anyways, with that tease out of the way, I hope you enjoyed this look back at the 7800 GTX, a GPU released right on the cusp of next generation games that allowed users to check them out. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell for instant notifications, support on Patreon, follow on Blue Sky, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen!